we've had a few questions from the audience, in particular talking about the idea of assumptions and expectations that are built into technology. So as Georgina and Eleanor said, who really is in that circle of majors?
I mean, I would say it depends which structure you're talking about. Eleanor's probably got a stronger background on this than I do, but there's the point of where the points of legitimacy start to come in. There's the point, I was thinking about this when I was pulling that together, there's the point where you're setting up visions in order to try and get some damn money. So you're talking about the funding circles and the funding scene then. But you're also talking about the power that gets set up within organisational structures as well. So and the type you've got, whether that's something that's coming from the top, whether it's certain groups that kind of shift it out to the side. So that's kind of the who's in, but there's the gatekeepers that come at each point as well, that if this thing is developed, like whether it kind of can get through and get pushed out into that too.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some degree it depends whether or not you have an organization that's capable of self-reflection about inclusion, which the Valley is really hot on not doing right now. And although it's not, even there, that's not universal. And I've actually seen one really amazing counterexample right now, which is Orion Labs, previously known as OnBeep, that just, they build Star Trek communicators. And they just released something called the Ruby, which is, it's a little thing, you put it there, you tap, you get instant voice kind of anywhere in the world. It's pretty cool, but the thing about it that's actually really cool is that they ship stuff that looks like jewelry, and they ship stuff that looks like jewelry that's specifically designed to make sure that it fits a very diverse base of users that reflects the people they intend to actually be selling it to. And they actually did it right. So it's not that it never happens, but that it takes serious reflection. And I think that's it's not that you shouldn't be able to define a circle of this is who we think this is for. It's that you should actually do it consciously.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the idea is what the visibility of these circles are, and often because of the dominant culture, we do see the products of it and the people that come out of it. And I mean, one of the things that was asked again on Twitter was terms like, when you use the word blurred and blipster, which I would completely hands up say I've never heard before, which is kind of self-explanatory, right? And the idea of black Twitters being, whether it's a case of those terms in particular are being used as a reaction against the existing tech world, or as a way of using it to create new space, and what that reaction is really.
It's definitely about using new space and reappropriating language and making it your own. I guess a lot about ownership, and I think digital spaces allow people to do that, and particularly those that are excluded in other spaces as well. So with Blurred, for example, I mean, like I said, even just the name Blurred, I'm a Blurred. So it's a nerd, someone who's interested in technology, they want to hack and do stuff, but there's something about making it that specific, which puts in other elements in there. So that poster that I had in there, it wasn't just about the individuality of yourself, it was about you as a black person engaging in that type of technology, and what that means for yourself and those coming after you, and what spaces you're putting yourself in.
Absolutely. I mean, there's been, as another example of that kind of reclamation of space is sex worker Twitter as well, where you do have the voices coming through from that particular minority, or the same minority, but that group that's not particularly represented by white male domination of Twitter. And cool. So if, we're kind of quoting Lord about that kind of question of, we know that we can't dismantle the tool with the master's tools, the master with the master's tools, then what do we have next, and how do we start? Where can we start making progress in that space?
Audre Lorde's quote, where can we start making the process? I mean, I think actually we're in quite an exciting time, I think, culturally, in terms of moving forward in what tools we do have. I mean, I was talking about the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and how I don't know if you can call it hashtag culture, but how that's really kind of propelled so many conversations that work across different groups, because it's there, it's visible. I mean, there was one, because I work a lot in black feminist spaces, So there was one which was hashtag solidarities for white women, which a lot of my white feminist friends engaged in a lot as well, which was really talking about the intersections of race and gender. And then there was solidarities for black men, which is gender within race. So in terms of opening conversations and, you've got that tool, you've got it, it's accessible, it's in your hand, it's affordable. I think I saw some stats in America that say something along the lines of black people with mobile phone usage, because a lot of people can't afford iPads and things like that. So something like Twitter and Facebook is a real kind of way that they can sort of engage in social networks. My family is part Trinidadian, and a friend of mine is doing a PhD in Trinidad, because Trinidad has got the most Facebook users per capita. It's only an island of like 1.5 million, but I think 1.4 million people are on Facebook there. So it's a perfect place to do their PhD in social media and what that actually means.
I mean, when we do kind of look at the idea of how we do imagine our futures, I mean, we kind of a lot of us are using existing narratives that have a very large kind of traditional background. So, for instance, the wizard and the demon and the watchtowers and even the craft, which is about 15 years old, right? I think
coming up to 20.
Yeah. And how do we sort of imagine those futures, and where is there place for other futures that we perhaps haven't seen yet? I mean, there's a question from the audience. If you do have any questions, then you can still tweet me. Were there other queer, trans, and other futurism that exist? Do they exist, or is this particular colonialism unique?
Oh, I'd be interested in the context of that one. It feels like, certainly there is like a lot of future imagining in whatever sense through kind of, again, different queer trans communities. I think the example of kind of different coding clubs, the example of even just setting up different spaces, kind of where conversations start happening, is its own forms of, if not utopia building, but just like setting out forms of alternatives of what might be, and that as a form of strength in itself. Not necessarily about these things articulating and hitting the ground, although God knows they could, but more to kind of give you that kind of that boost and that hit of energy to kind of get you through to the next stage, thinking we can get through this as well. I think it's definitely out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of yes, we're using traditional elements in I think all of the stories that we're telling in different traditions. But the whole point of myth is that it's just the kind of ambient stuff of culture that you can reach out and do whatever you need to do with. Yes, it means things, sort of, it has dispositions, it has tendencies, but you can rewrite all of that, and I think that's one of the things that the kind of chaos magic tradition that a lot of the stuff I was talking about is coming from, is a tradition that explicitly supports let's just take the stuff of the world and rewrite it, and it'll mean whatever we need a thing to mean in this context.
I mentioned Orisha culture in my talk as well, and sort of African ways of thinking about gender and things like that, which I think, actually Octavia Butler wrote a book called Wild Seed, which features a character, Anu, who changes gender to suit whatever situation she needs. Sometimes she's a white man, then she becomes a black woman, then she's a black man. And I think in sort of I definitely think there is a conversation in Afrofuturism, particularly now, around queerness in black culture. That's something that's really been pushed forward, particularly in Black Lives Matter campaign, which is run by 3 black queer women. It's very central in a lot of the conversations that are happening in those spaces.
Certainly. I mean, we might actually have a microphone on the floor still, if everyone does have any questions still.
Hi, thanks for your talks. One thing I wanted to ask about was, whenever describing anything using, metaphors or to a culture that is different to your own for, whatever reason, is how to maintain its integrity and accuracy and while still being able to communicate it across the various barriers that, we have.
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, everyone. But.
I mean, I guess it's the same way we tell any story, right? Storytelling is not hard, it's a skill, it's an art. And part of that art is about meeting the reader where they are and figuring out, like, okay, so I normally tell this story this way, but tonight I need to change who the hero is because otherwise something is going to get lost in translation. And I think they have to be living stories is kind of the answer, or my answer anyway.
I think there's something about acknowledging context, thinking about if it's appropriate to use the stories anyway, but if you are acknowledging context, I mean, the example I keep hearing about is the kind of the metaphors that, again, get used around the tech scene or kind of dragging bits over from other spaces or other parts or other communities. God, what was it? Someone was talking about something they'd seen of someone talking about this is what you can learn about Agile from being a Somali pirate, which just and I can't remember where this came from, so I might have got that slightly wrong. But it felt like on one level you're like, there's a very kind of thin layer that you can kind of see. There's mechanically that works, but what that strips out is every kind of social, global, political, specific context that comes with that. So no, but without acknowledging it, then you don't even get what that thing is or why that thing exists, like particularly there and locked into place in that thing, and why perhaps talking about agile techniques doesn't really hold or shouldn't hold there at all. But I think it's just like my usual push for kind of greater recognition of the social and political context of this stuff, and if they should get used at all in that way.
I think what's quite interesting in sort of like a lot of black science fiction, I mean, most of the things that I talked about were African American, and there does sometimes be a tendency with some African American writers to write about the continent in a sort of a mass, so it's just Africa and it's all one place, and there aren't all those little cultures and languages and all this sort of intricacies of what's happening in all those different areas. And now, because we are starting to see what can be described as like a kind of African cultural renaissance, I think someone asked me to retweet Shimarenga magazine, which I mentioned earlier, and there's a website, OK Africa, and so it's sort of people being able to speak for themselves through that media, and then to counteract some of the, I don't know what the word would be, but like kind of blanket views of a culture which is actually coming from still black people, but from a different side. So it's quite an interesting dynamic that's happening there at the moment.
Yeah. Any other questions? I can see a hand just here.
Hi. Thanks very much for the talks. They were all really interesting. A question, I guess, mostly for Georgina. It's really interesting you talk about visions and the importance of understanding what they're doing. But I think it's also interesting to look back and look where visions have got us as well. And a particular example I'm thinking of this is in the field of ubiquitous computing. Sort of look back at a vision of Mark Weiser from 20 years ago, and there's been a lot of introspection recently about where did this vision get us, how it's different from where we ended up. And I just wondered if you had any sort of thoughts of how people reflect on visions and how people use visions in the present, to look back and say, well, we've fulfilled this prophecy. We had a vision to get into this certain place, and sort of what you thought the role of, not only envisioning forward, but also how much work we do to understand visions. Looking back as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that, there's been kind of a ton of work that's kind of, again, looked back at exactly that point of how did we get to this point with nuclear power, with the space race, with computing, to try and deconstruct at which point certain decisions, whether consciously or unconsciously, were made.
Yeah,
it's that kind of quite really awesome, rich historical archaeological digging, or historical anthropology. They're trying to figure out at what stage were those decisions made to frame, for example, certain aspects of the space race as highly patriotic in a certain way of like, God damn it, we're going to do it before that particular group will. Or whether it's a sense of, I think the most interesting stuff is more where the visions are still in play, but it's still got you to a certain point, but what decisions do you make now to try and steer in one way or the other? So again, a lot of stuff around kind of energy regimes and, again, climate change, you're still in the middle of a series of kind of, not conflicting, but multiple visions and how they come into play. So there's certain value in being able to look back and say, well, that, for example, is people talking about a green regime because it's going to build us jobs. That is people talking about a green regime because it's for the climate. That is people talking about it for a green regime because it's a bigger holistic way of thinking about the world. but then being able to say, well, okay, if they've got us to this point, what does that mean if we turn around and start to try and take those things forward? So if we had, I don't want to get to another kind of like the internet, where are we now thing, but if we can have some, and why not?
And why not? Work?
And the next conference. If these visions don't stop, I think is the kind of point I'm trying to say here, that, the nearly final slide I have, expectations are, there's constantly a battle over expectations, that just because we're at this point now where we have this thing and there's a certain amount of visions that have got us to the point where this is the phone that fits in my hand, and that's why I haven't got a newer, bigger one yet, amongst other reasons. But there's a point of which of those visions are still in place, who still has power in that system to start pushing those things forward, and what modes of resistance do you have to start chipping away at them? Because, absolutely, unless you understand the history of them, and the kind of the social movement of them, you don't understand how they're going to move forward. But at the same time, there's a point where you have to kind of think, well, where next, and what are we going to do?
And is there a point still for visions? And as Ingrid mentioned, is there still a place for magic? I mean, it doesn't mean that we have to, because there is a kind of inherent sort of deception perhaps in the idea of visions, that we necessarily have to deconstruct them, because obviously there is, as we know from Afrofuturism and various other ways of kind of communicating the futures that you want, they're not always destructive, and they can be helpful, and they can bring kind of hope and alternatives. And a lot of it comes from maybe we can't necessarily, there's no real transparency about, you can't look at a story and know exactly, as you said before, each decision that's been made, each character that's been introduced, each protagonist that's been defined, that sort of thing. But I think it's a case of where if there are more stories and there are more ability for us to understand what these stories are, then we might have some version of at least some more representative ideations of technology. But, well, we're going to wrap up now because we've got the keynote happening, so we have to get out of it. But thank you very, very much, Georgina Voss, Eleanor Saitta, and Chardine Taylor-Stone. And I think I'm going to bring Mr. Tobias Revell back up here. So thank you again. Yeah.